I stood in the hallway of Greenwood Manor Nursing Home, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, when my sister Rachel grabbed my arm and pulled me into an empty visiting room. Her eyes were red and swollen, mascara smudged beneath them, and she leaned in close enough that I could smell the stale coffee on her breath. She looked around nervously, as if someone might be listening, then whispered with an urgency that made my stomach drop that Mom was almost gone. Maybe hours, maybe a day at most, and the nurses had said her breathing had changed, that rattling sound that meant the end was near. My mind went blank for a moment, that strange disconnect between hearing words and understanding their meaning, and I felt my phone heavy in my pocket, and without really thinking about why, without examining the impulse, I told Rachel I needed to make a call and walked quickly toward the exit, my footsteps echoing on the linoleum. Outside in the parking lot, the September air was thick and humid, threatening rain, and I scrolled through my contacts until I found a number from Martin Eisenberg, the estate attorney Mom had used years ago when she'd set up her will. My hands were shaking as I dialed, and I kept glancing back at the building, at the third-floor window where I knew Mom's room was, half expecting Rachel to come bursting out demanding to know what I was doing. Martin answered on the third ring, his voice professional and measured, and I blurted out that my mother was dying, that she was in the nursing home right now, that the doctor said it was a matter of hours, and I needed to know about the will, about what happened next, about the procedures and timelines, and whether there was anything I needed to do immediately. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of papers shuffling, and Martin asked me to slow down and take a breath, and he expressed his condolences in that practiced way attorneys do, warm enough to sound human, but detached enough to remain professional. He started explaining the process, how after Mom passed we would need to locate the original will, how in New York State the executor named in the will would need to file a petition with the Civil Court, how there would be a waiting period for creditors, how the estate couldn't be distributed until all debts were settled and taxes filed. I was only half listening, my attention divided between his words and the memory of Rachel's face, that mixture of grief and something else I couldn't quite identify, something that had been there for months now, ever since Mom's condition had really started deteriorating. Martin was still talking, explaining something about ancillary probate if Mom owned property in multiple states, when I interrupted him and asked a question that had been burning in my mind since Rachel had whispered to me in that hallway. I asked him directly, without preamble, whether it was possible for someone to change a will without the other beneficiaries knowing, whether someone with power of attorney could have altered Mom's estate plan in the final months when she was confused and medicated and barely knew what day it was. The line went quiet, and I could almost hear Martin choosing his words carefully, and he said that yes, technically, if the person still had sufficient mental capacity, they could execute a new will, but that mental capacity was a key issue, and any will sign when someone was under undue influence or lacked the ability to understand what they were signing could be contested, though such contests were expensive and emotionally draining, and didn't always succeed. I felt something cold settle in my chest because Rachel had been the one with power of attorney, Rachel, who had insisted she should handle everything because she lived closer, just 40 minutes away while I was 3 hours upstate. Rachel, who had been visiting Mom 3 or 4 times a week, who had been there for every doctor's appointment, every medication adjustment, every crisis. I had been grateful at the time, relieved even because my job was demanding and my kids were still young, and the drive down to Queens was exhausting, and it seemed reasonable, natural even, that Rachel would take the lead on Mom's care. But there had been small things, comments Rachel had made over the past year, about how she was sacrificing so much time, how her career had suffered, how she'd had to turn down a promotion because of all the hours spent managing Mom's affairs, comments delivered with just enough edge that they felt like accusations, like reminders of my inadequacy as a daughter. Martin was asking me if I had reason to believe something improper had occurred, and I realized I didn't have evidence. Just a gnawing suspicion, a pattern of small irregularities that individually meant nothing, but together formed a picture I didn't want to see. There was a time 6 months ago when I'd asked to see Mom's bank statements, and Rachel had been oddly defensive, saying she had everything under control and there was no need for me to worry about it, that I should focus on my own family. There was the afternoon I'd arrived at the nursing home unannounced and found Rachel in Mom's room a notary, and when I'd asked what was being notarized, Rachel had said it was just paperwork for the long-term care insurance. Nothing important, but she gathered up the documents quickly and wouldn't meet my eyes. There was a conversation just 2 weeks ago when Rachel had mentioned, almost casually, that she'd been thinking about how unfair it was that the inheritance would be split equally when she'd done all the work. And when I'd reminded her that was what Mom had wanted, that we'd both been there when the will was drawn up 15 years ago, Rachel had just smiled tightly and said that things change. That Mom perspective had evolved in her final years. I told Martin about these incidents, my words tumbling out faster now, and I could hear how paranoid I sounded, how petty and grasping, but I couldn't stop myself. I told him about how Rachel had been the one to choose Greenwood Manor over the other facilities we'd toured, even though it was more expensive, and how Rachel had been the one to insist that Mom needed round-the-clock care in the memory unit, even though the doctors had said she was still capable of some independence. I told him about the new car Rachel had bought last year, a BMW, which had seemed strange given that she'd been complaining about money for years, and about the vacation to Turks and Caicos she posted about on Facebook, all sandy beaches and cocktails, while I was dealing with my son's learning disabilities and my husband's job uncertainty. Martin listened without interrupting, and when I finally stopped talking, breathless and embarrassed, he said that if I had concerns about the administration of Mom's estate or the validity of her will, I should document everything I could remember, save all emails and text messages, and be prepared to potentially hire a litigator if my suspicions prove correct, though he cautioned me again that will contests were ugly affairs that could destroy family relationships permanently. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was worried about destroying a relationship that might already be destroyed, that might have been built on a foundation of resentment and scorekeeping that I've been too naive or too conflict-averse to acknowledge. Rachel and I had never been particularly close, even as children, always competing for Mom's attention, for her approval, operating in different spheres with different strengths. Rachel was the organized one, the planner, the one who remembered birthdays and made elaborate holiday arrangements, while I was the creative one, the dreamer, the one who forgot to return phone calls and showed up late to family events with hastily purchased gifts. Mom had loved us both. I believed that, but there had always been a sense that Rachel was a reliable daughter, the one who would be there in crisis. And maybe that belief had been self-fulfilling, had created the very dynamic that was now tearing us apart. Martin was explaining something about the fiduciary duty of a power of attorney, how Rachel would have been legally obligated to act in Mom's best interests and not her own, when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Rachel, just 2 words asking where I was, and I felt a surge of guilt mixed with anger, guilt that I was standing in a parking lot talking to a lawyer, instead of being at Mom's bedside in her final hours, anger that Rachel had put me in a position where I felt I couldn't trust her, where every interaction was filtered through suspicion. I told Martin I had to go, and he said to call him after the funeral, that we could schedule a meeting to review the will and discuss my options, and I thanked him and ended the call, standing there for a moment in the heavy air, trying to compose myself. When I walked back into Greenwood Manor, the receptionist gave me a sympathetic look, that particular expression people reserve for those whose loved ones are dying, and I took the elevator to the 3rd floor, my reflection in the metal doors, showing someone who looked old and I felt tired and defeated. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and overcooked vegetables, and I could hear a television playing somewhere, the cheerful sounds of games so incongruous with the atmosphere of slow decline that permeated the place. Mom's room was at the end of the hall, and as I approached I could see through the partially open door that Rachel was sitting beside the bed, holding Mom's hand, her head bowed in what might have been prayer or just exhaustion. I pushed the door open and Rachel looked up, and for a moment I saw my sister as she really was. Not the villain I'd been constructing in my mind, but just another daughter about to lose her mother, scared and sad, and trying to hold everything together. Mom was barely recognizable, her face skeletal, her breathing labored and irregular, that death rattle the nurses had mentioned clearly audible now. I moved to the other side of the bed and took Mom's other hand, the skin paper thin and cool, and Rachel and I sat there in silence. The only sound, that terrible breathing and the beep of the monitors and the distant sounds of the nursing home continuing its daily routines around us. Rachel finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, asking where I'd gone, and I lied instinctively, said I needed some air, that I'd been feeling overwhelmed. She nodded, seeming to accept this, and said that the nurse had told her it wouldn't be long now, that we should say whatever we needed to say, that Mom could probably still hear us even if she couldn't respond. I looked at Mom's face, trying to find some resemblance to the woman who had raised me, who had braided my hair and helped with homework and taught me to drive. But that woman was gone, had been gone for months really, replaced by this fragile shell that was now slowly shutting down, system by system, breath by rattling breath. I wanted to ask Rachel directly, right then, whether she'd changed the will, whether she'd taken advantage of Mom's confusion to rewrite history in her favor. But the moment felt too sacred for accusations, and besides, what would I do if she admitted it? We would still be here, in this room, with our dying mother between us, and nothing I said or did would change what was about to happen. So instead I told Mom that I loved her, that I was sorry I hadn't been there more, that I hoped she knew how much she'd meant to me, and my voice broke on the last words, tears finally coming after hours of numbness. Rachel was crying too, and she echoed my sentiments, adding her own apologies and expressions of love, and for a few minutes we were united in our grief, sisters again if only temporarily. Mom's breathing changed around sunset, becoming more irregular, longer pauses between each breath, and Rachel called for the nurse who came and checked Mom's vital signs and said it was a matter of minutes now. I held Mom's hand tighter, as if I could anchor her to this world through sheer force of will, and Rachel was praying, a prayer I half remember from childhood. Words about walking through valleys and fearing no evil. Mom took one more shallow breath, then another, then nothing, and we waited, both of us frozen. And when it became clear that no more breaths were coming, that she was truly gone, the nurse gently confirmed what we already knew and asked if we wanted a few minutes alone with her. We both nodded, and the nurse left, and Rachel and I sat there with Mom's body, which already seemed different, emptier, no longer the person we'd known, but just remains. Rachel said something about needing to call the funeral home, that they'd made prearrangements, that she had all the paperwork, and I felt that suspicion flare up again, wondered what else she had paperwork for, what other arrangements she'd made without my knowledge. But I pushed it down because Mom deserved better than for her daughters to start fighting before her body was even cold. So I just nodded and said, we should probably also start calling family members, letting people know, beginning the process of grief that would consume the next days and weeks. We made the calls together, taking turns speaking to aunts and uncles and cousins, repeating the same information over and over until the words lost meaning. Uncle Frank said he'd drive up from Baltimore, and Aunt Diane started crying immediately and said she'd been expecting this call, but it was still a shock, and our cousin Jennifer asked about funeral arrangements and whether we needed help with anything. Through it all, Rachel and I maintained a veneer of cooperation, coordinating our responses, presenting a united front to the family, but there was a brittleness to our interactions, a careful distance, like two diplomats from hostile nations forced to work together on a joint statement. The funeral home arrived around 9 that evening, 2 men in dark suits with a gurney, and they were professional and efficient and somehow managed to make the process feel dignified rather than gruesome. They asked us if we wanted to say any final goodbyes, and Rachel went to Mom first, kissing her forehead and whispering something I couldn't hear, and then it was my turn, and I touched Mom's face one last time, already growing cold, and told her I would miss her and that I was sorry for everything, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. Then they zipped her into a black bag and wheeled her away, and Rachel and I were left in the empty room with Mom's belongings, clothes in the closet, photos on the windowsill, a lifetime reduced to a few personal items that would need to be sorted and distributed or discarded. Rachel said she would take care of clearing out the room, that I should go home and get some rest, that we could deal with everything else tomorrow or the next day. And I wanted to argue, wanted to insist on being part of every decision, but I was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained, and the drive back upstate seemed impossibly long. So I agreed, and Rachel and I hugged awkwardly at the elevator, and I promised to call her in the morning, and I left her there in the nursing home, surrounded by Mom's things, and drove home through the dark.